everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. I'm Joe Moore, joined by Bruce Damer, president and co-founder of Center for Minds. How are you today, Bruce?
I am spectacular today.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this one. I told you a few times, but I want to make sure everybody else knows that you're a major inspiration for me via everything that was published on Psychedelic Salon, a lot of your early talks. Very, very inspiring around creativity and, what's possible. Also, your use of the word conviviality. It was really helpful for me. Actually, maybe we can start there. Like, what is this conviviality word? And why do you think it was so important a few years back to share that one with us?
I think it's because, if we get too serious about life and about each other, we can get all tangled up in knots. And one of the things that I was taught by Sasha Shulgin, who left us about 10 years ago now, was the idea of a lightweight way of taking things. Now, this is a man that synthesized 1,200 compounds and took little teaspoons, even smaller than teaspoons, little tiny spoons of white powder to test it. So he had to take things fairly lightly and hold things lightly. And if you looked in his blue eyes, every time I looked in his blue eyes, I felt a sense of levity. And levity translates to conviviality because he was so gracious, and so was Terence McKenna. That's one thing that struck me. He was so kind to any questioner. He was never crabby. He took himself pretty lightly, even concepts of the eschaton in 2012 and whatnot. He told jokes about himself a lot, and I think during 2012 I was with a psychedelic comedian sitting underneath Grand Central Station in New York in the cafe, telling jokes about it. And we took ourselves too seriously, I think. And in general in life, there's sort of the doom and gloom kind of cohort that comes in to try to get our attention. And we're doing this to ourselves. And if we take it lightly, actually, a friend of mine from Romania said that if you have a lot of jokes and a lot of humor in your society, it's very hard for dictators to get a foothold. So there's a lesson for our immediate future there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Go see stand-up comedy, everybody. It helps fight fascism. That's excellent. I love that. So, Bruce, let's dig into, I suppose, like a high level of what Center for Minds is, and then we can rewind the tape and walk to the creation, how we got there.
The high level is that psychedelics seem to have four, in a sense, applications or practices in human civilization. The first being indigenous, initiation rites, with Iboga in Africa, things like that. All cultures had initiation with an ordeal poison, a practice, or in some cases, a psychoactive. And then there's personal and spiritual growth, which we saw come back to the West starting in the 50s into the 60s, and therapeutic benefit, which we're in the great age of that. But there was a fourth, which was for the intellect. And in this amazing book of letters, if the audience hasn't seen it, Psychedelic Prophets, it's a couple of hundred letters between Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond. And for those not in the known, Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic for psyche and delios from Greek, which meant mind manifesting. And he brought the bottle of mescaline to Aldous Huxley's at his home in Los Angeles to give him his first trip, which is described in the book Doors of Perception, which launched psychedelia in the West, in the modern West. And those two were trying to do something called Project Outsight, which would be that they already knew even then that psychedelics gave you tremendous inner insight. And we tend to go there, on our trips. But they also open an outsight into the cosmos, into the world, how things work, how humans work, the great sort of project of being that's outside of the individual. And they felt that this was really important. And so this whole approach, this whole thread came up a cropper in the mid 60s when criminalization came down on research studies like Willis Harman and Jim Fadiman's study with professionals, mathematicians and scientists and even an architect taking psilocybin or mescaline and doing creative work, either in the acute phase or the post-acute phase, seeing how it unlocked their minds, their intellect. And that all went up in smoke in the mid 60s. And what Minds is about is this fourth path, or this fourth way for psychedelic research and practice, which is to bring it back in the 2020s, 60, 70 years later, on the heels of the therapeutic revolution. And so what we're doing is sponsoring research. We're taking a page from MAP's playbook and sponsoring studies. And literally next month, we're announcing our first major study at a major university that we will have, raised beautiful donor dollars for, gifting it on, and having a 3-year project which will involve human subject trials and a global survey. It's just a wonderful place to start. And then studies of creativity in its naturalistic setting. Robin Carhart Harris has told us, hey, if you're going to look at what induces flashes of insight, great creative insight, you can't do it while somebody's in an fMRI scanner. It's just not going to happen there. This big noisy machine. It needs to happen in its naturalistic setting. So another aim of Minds is to sponsor and support studies of practice groups that are already working this way, individuals, and working with Manesh Gurn, actually at UCSF, who works with Robin, to ask the question of the global community, how do we collectively develop science to study the active creative genius itself? And there's many, many fields that back that into that. But then how do psychedelics impact that in the full ecosystem of creative insight and download? And then the final thought here is that if we can unlock more of this genius in ourselves, in our fellows, we can meet the challenges of that humanity faces in the future. In fact, it may be the only way we can face these challenges. We just need insights way beyond what AI can cobble together from our previous murmurings. We need original, brilliant thought in science and tech, even in leadership. We need that. And the last point here is that it rounds it all up, because if capitalism itself and the people who are making the widgets that change the world go through these practices, go through a psychedelic initiation, they can have their healing as well as their revealing. So we'll end up with more conscious companies, for example, and way more dialed in, inclusive unity approaches to solving problems, bringing products to market, and then deciding what not to bring to market for the benefit of the human future. We can roll capitalism in this way. And so that's the grand, in the grand scheme of things. Everyone, in our community said, what if we got all the world's leaders together in a room and gave them substance X? Well, that may or may not work. I mean, you have to do this carefully. You have to understand what will work. So you need the science, and you need the practice, and you need the data, and you need to have effective practices and good protocols. So that's what Minds is being born to do.
Love that. So thanks for sharing that. So let's turn it back to you. I know you did some really interesting work at NASA. You've coined some really interesting terms around what the hell would it be? Endogenous psychedelic experiences, perhaps, like very interesting concepts. And you're not speaking from ignorance here. You've had some interesting experience with breakthroughs here. But let's talk. How did you perhaps come to this psychedelic world, and then how did you get interested in engineering for groups like NASA?
Well, it sort of all goes in a single bundle, but I was a very nerdy and I would suggest Aspergery or even semi-autistic kid. And in the 1960s, there was no diagnosis for us, not even a term for autism, really, that was in the culture. So my parents, they actually picked me up in an adoption ward. I was given up at birth, and that's a big deal for a little being, that you're kind of in this ward for a while and you don't ever sort of see and smell the mother. So that creates a rupture. And so that's maybe anecdotal, but for me, I was very much in my own world. And my parents said, "Oh, that's fine. He'll wander the hillsides of Victoria, British Columbia. He'll do his thing. We'll let him be in his own worlds, his drawings, his imaginations, and his musings." And I used to do something starting when I was about 9 years old, which was I closed my eyes in the afternoon or at night, mostly in the afternoon. If I had a stimulating day, I could see this kind of patterning of light behind my closed eyes. And it wasn't my brother shining a flashlight at me, it was coming from inside. And I then trained my mind to shut down all the processes possible, to let those patterned washes turn into something, see if they would grow, kind of like an old-fashioned TV set that you're adjusting. And I got it to work. So then I got to tune into like a cable TV channel of weird stuff. And this is known in psychology as hypnagogia or hypnagogia. Terrence loved to talk about this as well. It's sort of the gateway drug to visionary experience. But I could tune this thing such that I could actually create a palette, like a canvas that would have these spacecraft going across, all kinds of stuff that wasn't from my imagination. It was sort of a download. And I drew them. I drew thousands of pictures of these things. And I think Carl Jung did the similar thing in his Red Book paintings. So that's a nerdy kind of internal kid. Then I got interested in computers, and they were like another palette, another internal world that was divorced from the problems of humanity, and you could create universes there. And I studiously avoided drugs of all types, cannabis, alcohol, nothing, because I felt I had a delicate system and I didn't want to, shatter the machinery, until I met Terrence in the late 90s. And I figured that this guy is amazingly brilliant and kind, and he's a little cracked, but so am I. So I felt a sort of bird of the feather, and he turned me on. He provided the mushrooms to take my first epic dose. Later, hearing his voice in my head, get a scale. So if you don't have a scale, for me, I just ate the entire supply. Talk about a gormless, early trippers. Like, Terrence provided this bag of mushrooms. I'll just eat them all and see what happens. They might not work. Well, they did work, and I went to the center of the cosmos, and I had a astounding trip that I had to navigate through fear and total dissolution and the whole thing, all within one evening in the wilderness in the southern Sierra Nevada here. And when I shared it with Terrence, it kind of curled his already curly hair, and hence the get a scale. But it was a good headlong dose, So from that point on, I realized that they weren't going to destroy my capacity to ideate and create things. They were actually going to juice it up. They were releasing me from the bonds of trauma and little held up parts of me. And I'm 36, 37 years old. So folks, if you think you have a delicate constitution and mind, you might want to avoid these things till later, because I already had a baked in career. And I think it was a good age for me to start. So pretty late for this community. And then I experimented for the next 10 or 15 years in which substances both helped me in my healing process, especially around the rupture, around my birth, And then the revealing process got clearer and better. And I learned about down dosing to very, very small doses and using other energetic systems. That's something we could talk about later. That's the nitty gritty of the protocol I developed for myself. But there's the sweep of the story.
It's beautiful. Thanks. I love that you were experimental with it and developed a protocol that worked for you in time. I think let's maybe talk about how you were able to solve interesting problems for, I guess, aerospace with your mind. Like you were able to just kind of envision a solution, very similar to how Fadiman would talk about it at that research site.
Yeah, and actually, it's a good point you bring that up, Joe, because if people look up, I think it's called Psychedelics as Creative Catalysts. Jim Fadiman, the first author is Willis Harman, who sponsored the study, 1966. You can find this online. And there's a block quote in there that describes an architect who he was either on mescaline sulfate or he's on LSD 25. But he describes sitting there after in the post-acute phase, going to their own room and sitting there. And he had been challenged for months by this project to build a shopping center, a craft shopping center. So it wasn't just any shopping center in LA on a 300-foot by 300-foot lot, which is difficult. And the approaches were difficult. And he sat there and he had done what we're now at Minds calling setup. So you have set and setting. We all know the terms. I think they were coined by Ralph Metzner or Leary or one of the gang. The setting is the environment that you're in. You know, playing Ride of the Valkyries was not good setting when they were doing their early experiments. You know, they learned about the proper setting. Set is the mindset you're coming in with. Are you in a positive way? Are you a little bit in the jitter side, as most of us are going in? But setup is everything that you've put in terms of your intention, but also if you're doing this for creative innovation, it's the training. So the old adage, garbage in, garbage out, is totally true for any kind of technical ideation. If you haven't read the literature, if you haven't pumped into your brain all of the previous designs and efforts around the question, you're not really going to get a good result. You need that feedstock. And so this architect had done that, and he was a trained person, and he had just ground around this 300-foot lot. He'd stood there and etc. So going into the room during the Harman study, it all just flooded in. And he describes this beautifully in the paper. He said, I saw everything. I saw where the buildings would be, how to do the parking, all of the utilities. To make it beautiful, it was complete in my mind. It was weeks of work. It was all just there. I saw it as a living thing. This structure, the way people would flow, and he could now go and build it. And he said it was remarkable for him, the clarity, the lucidity of this. And so that was an early bellwether on, wow, this is an amazing tool. What is going on here? So rolling through to my own ideation, starting in the 9-year-old doing the patterning and the hypnagogia, that grew into what I call endo-tripping, which is tripping on your own juices. Terence used to say on the natch. It's a little more funny, but endo-tripping, endo-tripping is a thing. I talked about it on a podcast about 10 years ago, and I got dozens of people writing that, I'm on a bus, they're playing Yellow Submarine, and I'm in a mathematical universe suddenly, wide awake. It's not necessarily lucid dreaming. It's not imagination. It's download, while you're fully awake, and it just takes you over and it's a phenomenon, and I think it needed a new name, so I came up with the name endo-tripping. And then there's exo-tripping, which is introducing something, some kind of stimulant, or even, frankly, breath work. It changes your vagal nerve system and your neurochemistry in an instant. And it's kind of like an endo-exo trip. And so meditation, all of that. So I realized that it's probably a combination of setting and setup, plus a practice of endo-tripping, like being open to these downloads, but having an observer camera on board. So you have your little observer camera that says, I'm separate from that. I'm also going to turn my brain functions off. I'm going to turn my critical brain function, or self-criticizing, or to-do list that's going to distract me. I'm going to shut down to a low state, almost like a Vipassana type state. Let the endo-trip, invite the endo-trip. It may come unbidden. It may come at any time. But I immediately go to my control panel, and then I start up my recording, my 3D holographic high-speed camera, because we've got to remember this download. And this is all without drugs, right? This is all without being in the throe of a full-on, psychedelic raging thing, or an ayahuasca serpentine thing. And so you're recording. And what you can do when you're endo-tripping is even re-record, re-pattern to develop more memory. So I would actually, in my endo-trips, pause the endo-trip and come and draw and write notes. And then if I was still in that held state, I would be able to go back in, and it would start up at a different place. It somehow keeps running. Now I'm in cold water. I was in hot water and watching protocells form. And now the protocells are floating in cold water, and they're merging. Those are the kinds of endo-trips I was doing before psychedelia. So going into psychedelia, I was actually worried about disturbing this system. So I put a mental firewall up saying, okay, all the endo-tripping machinery is powered off because I don't want a psychedelic to interfere with it. And after 10 years and finding the right doses and the right whole thing, I actually powered up my endo and exo tripping, partitions at the same time. And that's when the magic really started to happen in astrobiology and the work I'm doing on where life can start.
Yeah, brilliant. So thanks for that. And I think this is a good transition into this whole Origins of Life project. I think I've heard you talking about this for years, but you recently had a ayahuasca fueled breakthrough. Could you maybe talk about this Origins of Life project and the importance of that, and how ayahuasca maybe helped?
Yeah. So that all rolling forward, the natural rolling onward. So discovering ayahuasca, my initial experience with psilocybin, with mushrooms, too many mushrooms, but they cracked open the system. They cracked they broke open my head, as Daniel Pinchbeck described so beautifully. And then there was exploration with the other classics. And then I was invited to the jungle in 2011. And that was a phenomenal experience. That was because, in a sense, you're taking a medicine that is multivariate, that has 10,000 compounds in it, not just like the active tryptamine that we know is there, and the MAOI, which is helping the tryptamine to get through. There's a lot of other things going on, and there's a setting that is tremendously stimulating. Billions of insects, and thousands of jungle animals, and old world monkeys and toucans, and the river and the plants and the hormones in the air, and the Icaros, and it's just tremendous. In fact, I might argue that we may not have needed the stoned ape. we just had the stimulation of the rainforest was enough to grow consciousness because there's so much going on. It's a symphony. And so that alone is a trippy environment. And so then you take a long used concoction, this beautiful concoction, which is not beautiful to the palate, but our particular shaman, this is high in the remote regions outside of Pucallpa in Peru. What they did was they had perfected a technique to make the medicine such that they could get it down to a paste, a really thick paste. Think castor oil. And so as a result, when they would hand out the cup, you could actually get a really measured dose. So what I realized was I could start with a drop. I could get down to a drop of this stuff. So rather than it being diluted in water, where it's like, well, you kind of have to just knock the whole thing back, I could down dose, I could titrate tremendously easily. And I could even hold it on my tongue. And I know this will gross out the viewers here, but I had a practice of holding it on my tongue and talking to it, saying making an agreement and a contract with it. And you're not really tasting it. I mean, it's the whole feeling comes when you take the whole thing down, but I prepare my gut as well and say to my gut, this is a food, this is your nourishment. And which it really was. And I ended up going down to 1/24th of a dose and finding a sweet spot around 1/16th or 1/24th. And with that, there was an agreement, and I'd done it maybe 30 times, previously to get to this point. The agreement was, we have an intention here. It's to work on the little rupture of the little one born, maybe stillborn in some ways. But also, when we move beyond that, we're going to journey. We're going to really travel. And I made a deal with Mama Aya when she would show up in all her terrifying glory, to merge, to actually have partnership, to have communitas in a way, as Jamie Wheel would describe. And we did a dance. We traveled together. And one night, after this long relationship, she actually allowed me to re-experience my birth and my conception into my birth. Literally, I became the sperm, traveling, my father's sperm traveling into my mother's egg. And then I became an embryo at 4 months, just becoming conscious in my mother's belly, and I felt her love. And that's all I needed for the unraveling of the rupture, just to feel that mother's love, which I'd never felt. And it's sort of a missing thing that a newborn doesn't know that they're not having. And so they create other things, other structures. They become deeply into the self, into management of the little being, because they don't know there's nothing outside that is helping, is pulling them out. So they become autistic. So it could be the roots of autism or certain types of it. But I learned to be my own caregiver. But not feeling the mother's love, you're missing a lot. And so for those few instants before they gave me up, because I heard whispering voices and looked out past the Maloka, and there was a shadow of two people talking. And that was my parents deciding that this one had to be given up because they were so poor. They were so kind of desperate in a way. So I could forgive them. I could understand. And I actually met both of them later in life. And I got the story from that side. So that one evening, that cleared. So suddenly you're clear. And I realized because I was using basically an endo-tripping together with the exo-tripping, where I was bringing myself to it. I was super present. And perhaps I was even creating my own DMT, endogenous DMT in terms of flushes. That's a whole other story. That I had more capacity. So I turned to Mama Aya, her archetype anyway, and said, thank you. Thank you for this gift. I feel complete. Uh, I feel all the way down past the hard knot. The hard knot is gone. And I said to her, "Would you like to go back to where we were all born? To the birth of us all? Because I think we can take a run at this thing." And there was a kind of a nod, if a ethereal spirit psychedelic being can nod. And anyway, so we then merged. So the practice was then to merge into one thing, and it was a whole practice I developed. So there wasn't a dualism. Now we were one inquiry, one mind, one spirit. And then I pushed a button on my Endo-Tripping library and said, "Let's go. We're going to reverse course, and we're going to go back down the sperm that you had me become, and we're going to swim backwards into the father's body, into the grandfather's body, and back and back and back and back, and start accelerating through the animals all the way through, through the fishes, through the tetrapods into the fishes, and then you start hitting the little simple things like the anneliid worms, and this was an endo trip. It was Dawkins' ancestor's tail, in high speed. And then you hit the cloud of microbiota, which is the big one, right? It's this massive cloud of organisms, single-celled organisms. And I'm powering through that and watching my brain temperatures, because, doing the endo-tripping in high speed is a huge cognitive tax when you do them. And broke through just before I felt I was about to break out, in terms of what I could do, into the fog above a volcanic island 4 billion years ago, and then pirouetted and went straight into the hydrothermal pool where we think, the hot spring environments, where our science was pointing for years that perhaps this is a better place than the oceans. And then getting into that pool, you become fully embodied. Now you are what is happening. So I became the protocells in that pool, and I became a particular protocell that seemed to have a glowing neon in it. And that neon was polymers that are formed through wet and dry cycling. And this is what we've been doing in the lab for years. We can stitch together RNA through wet and dry cycling. And we even started to go to hot springs to do it. But we couldn't figure out what was beyond that. The wet dry cycling, getting a long polymer, getting it into a lipid compartment, and then what? And so I became, what happens in that state, and I find that your spirit guide, your archetypal spirit guide, Mama Aya, you've merged with her. You've gone to a place that's so far out, it's so far beyond your experience. And then there's another thing that's beyond that. There's another intelligence that you can ping. And I always ask the same question: what do I do? Where do I go? And the answer always is become it. Just become it now. Lose yourself. And I became that glowing, neon glowing protocell. And then I started to black out. And I asked the question, what is happening? And the great intelligence, the great art director said, you asked to be born. How can you be born unless you die? And so I was gone for who knows how long, and I came to life screaming as my body was the protocell. There was no body, and it's like what Ram Dass or Richard Alpert describes, going and sitting on the couch in Tim Leary's home and seeing no body, no self. I was that thing, and I was in the midst of tearing apart, and the ripping of part of me off to another part, and the other part was black and it was dying. It had been alive and it went out, but my body was more alive, and I watched polymers move like piano keys. And that was the most stunning vision. And it had more questions than answers. And then I came out of it running that endo trip. I had such a high speed recording of it, due to my practice, that I was running it over and over and asking the questions and what was going on. And one of the answers was death writes the code of life. And 3 months later, in a fantastic endo-trip that flooded in after breathwork and yoga, the whole thing just completely downloaded as a complete vision, just like the architect's shopping center. But it was the entire cycling of protocells with their polymers in their trillions and quintillions through the pool, through wet-dry cycling. They would float out, and the ones would fall apart, and others would come back down as the pool dried down and form this mush, this kind of slush of protocells, and then light would hit it and reagents would get pulled into it, and there would be this cooking process of the first metabolism, and then everything would dry to thin layers and resynthesize, and it was literally the pattern of life emerging itself, sort of wet and dry in this pumped engine driven by geysers. And I came out of that endo trip and drew pages of drawings and notes, sent them to my colleague David Deemer at UC Santa Cruz, and he wrote back the same day. This was like January 3rd, 2014, and he wrote back, "You found it. You found the kinetic trap." So it was the eureka moment where we'd found a way for polymers to get created and then get more complex, just as Charles Darwin had suggested for the warm little pond, and go through selection, go through pre-Darwinian selection. And it was the engine of creation. It was a Genesis engine. And it ended up, going into publication in 2015, and it ended up here, on the cover of Scientific American in
Wow.
2017. And I actually held this up at Lightning in a Bottle, of all places. This is a festival here on the West Coast, and there's the entire thing. There's the Genesis landscape is there with the wet-dry cycling pool in the circle. And here's what they did with the visionary thing. This protocells are forming in the dry phase, budding off, going through, and you have this little thin wedge there. And that's the beginnings of the progenote, the first prototypical microbial colony in the pool. And that's the whole thing. And so what you have to do in this particular game, when you have a visionary download, it has to go through peer review. It has to go through due diligencing, and then it has to go into testing. Like the architect, they went and built the freaking shopping center, and we published the hypothesis, and it's kind of rolled through all of astrobiology now. It's cited every day in an article written somewhere, and teams are working all over the planet on wet-dry cycling, and we're working in New Zealand and Rotorua, bubbling pools, and my Gandalfian quest to Mordor to to find the ring. It's just been tremendous. And so all of that happened, and then one day, because based on Dennis McKenna's recommendation, I got a call from the New Yorker, and they wanted to do a profile. You know how the New Yorker does these profiles. They're pretty high level. And halfway through the interview, I said, "You know what? You can't use my name, because it could disrupt our science. It could cast aspersion on me as a serious person, because we're in a very buttoned down field. We're in a field full of Nobel Prize winners in chemistry, and who I know personally, and how are they going to react?" And so I said no. And so it wasn't until 2022, again at the behest of Dennis McKenna, that I did a keynote at his ESPD conference in the UK. That went on YouTube. That went a little bit viral. And then meeting Ford and Sylvia, who you met in Aspen recently, we were just leaving a party, a birthday party in Austin, and this couple was there, and I was there with Catherine. We're another couple, and they were curious. Maybe it's the beard or whatever it is. And they came up to talk to us just before we left. And I described this. I said, "You know what? I've just come out of the psychedelic scientist closet. And this is what happened. And the light bulb went off in Ford because he had just talked to Tim Ferriss. And Tim Ferriss had said, there's a guy that I talked to who had a download on 5-MeO DMT, and he's come up with a new physics theory for warp drive. And Tim was just fascinated. And so the light bulb going off twice in Ford's head led to Minds, because Ford said there's something here. We can fund psychedelic ventures, and that's good. We can fund science, but what about this? What about this path? What about this idea? And they decided to help start Minds. So it was in Aspen, in the shower in Aspen at a friend's house with, Ford and Sylvia were there. We were on a little bit of a tour last summer that I came up with the acronym for Minds, because it's like all scientific organizations need to have acronyms to be credible, and MAPS is multidisciplinary, so we're going to be multidisciplinary. And after MAPS, what happens? Minds, maybe. MAPS is about the heart, the soul, the trauma, but Minds, opening up minds. So we're multidisciplinary investigation into novel discoveries and solutions. So the whole gamut of how does this happen, and how do we investigate how this happens, and we want to come up with novel discoveries, and then we want to land them into solutions. So that's the whole long diatribe of my experience all the way to, and I hope that for the listeners they can derive some clues for their own practice.
Let's hope. Yeah, I think I really gravitated to this idea when I learned about it in Fadiman's book. When it clicked that we're, I don't know if handful is the right term. Say 50 is an okay number. 50 really great engineering solutions away from being able to avert this climate catastrophe. And that's a garbage number, just kind of made it up. And I'm thinking like, okay, if GE or other large organizations could somehow capitalize on some of these developments, they could put it out at scale ahead of the worst of looming climate disaster. Whatever those things are, it could be improved solar tech, better turbine blade design, or whatever, better cells, PV cells or something. So that's kind of how I leaned into it. And then there's probably all sorts of interesting things around food security and water security, things like that. And perhaps being able to hide out in big heat waves more safely, because those are coming. And, so I took it in a really practical direction, but I love that you took it in kind of a foundational science of life, origins of life position to help us kind of flesh out that understanding. 'Cause it's really important to science, I believe.
And Joe, 100 years ago, in 1922, 3, 4, Albert Einstein had just won the Nobel Prize, I think for the photoelectric effect rather than for relativity. But when relativity theory came into the culture, it was fundamental science, but it changed the world. It helped usher in the era of modernism, where kings and all this sort of absolutism of history was turned on its head, because even time seemed to be flexible. The speed of light wasn't, but space was bendable, and so was time. Your frame was relative to all other frames, so your point of view was as relevant as any other point of view. So it was a revolutionary idea. And in the 2020s, this partially psychedelically fueled innovation, that the origin of life, that we're looking down the barrel of a microscope and we're able to see our own creation, the processes that made life and still sustain it. And it turns out that life didn't start, if this pans out, if this whole approach pans out, life didn't start with individuals at all. It didn't start with competition. It started with a network of protocells and circuits that grew as a mass, that grew into what was called the progenote, which was a collaborative medium. that of course there were competitive elements for resource. Maybe there was an early virome that was driving a kind of that sort of thing. But initially, the microbial world was highly stratified into what are called consortia. And that the idea of competition red in tooth and claw, which was a Victorian idea, a survival of the fittest, for example, a term that was coined by Herbert Spencer, perhaps shouldn't be our guiding North Star for our civilization. The actual North Star is what's under our feet and in our guts, which is the collaborative communities of the microbiome. And they support the whole planet. So the whole planet is a progenote planet. It's a huge collaborative exercise in sharing and collecting energy and coevolution. And so this idea can be powerful for culture and its fundamental science. It's sort of 21st century version of the theory of relativity.
Fascinating. Okay. So as potentially impactful as relativity.
And
I'd love that.
And you're absolutely completely right that if we can light up the creative spark in corporations and startups, one of the frightening things that when we did some of the research for Minds is this article, I think it was in Harvard Business Review, it's on our website, that disruptive patents and papers are crashing since 1980. So we are over specializing. We're grinding young people into narrow specializations and very rote tech jobs. And even in science, it's bench chemistry in our field, which can grind you to a pulp. We don't encourage broad thinking, multidisciplinary studies. We don't even allow young people to take up big questions at our universities and even at our companies. So we lose the most malleable plastic minds to this over specialization, and of course commercial drivers. So in our field, for example, a young investigator starting a lab won't get their first NIH grant till they're 42. They're mostly through their creative career. At that point, they're now doing paperwork to run a group at a university, 42 years old. And it used to be that in their late 20s, they'd get an NIH grant. So that would support their early work, even as a newly minted postdoc. But it just doesn't happen. So we're leaving genius on the table and when we need it most. So how do we restart that system? How do we unleash that? And there's so much genius lost.
I like your phrasing. How can we get back in touch with that genius? Maybe we do it in the ancient Greek sense of the word genius, but I think there's some really good stuff here. And we know this from art, at least. Like a lot of artists are kind of through their best phase by the time they're 35, 40. But if we can open that window up and make it longer via psychedelics, perhaps we can have more breakthroughs. And I finally read Thomas Kuhn's book somewhat recently after hearing about it forever. And I think we're in that kind of quagmire still. Like, despite Einstein bringing relativity forward 100 years ago or so, we're still operating a really Cartesian frame in a lot of sciences and engineering. And I think we could do a lot better if we can bring in contemporary, like the foundations of physics a little bit closer to this stuff.
And so can you imagine that prior to, say, entering graduate school, I was lucky enough in high school to have an amazing PhD chemistry teacher just in our high school. What he realized is that if students were to go into science and really do world-changing things, they needed something special. So he had these lunchtime brown bag sessions. You could bring your lunch to the lab, and he would introduce us to quantum mechanics. And then he introduced us to mental blockbusting, it was called in that time. And examples, kind of silly examples, but it showed you how to think outside the box. He said, you have a pipe cemented into the ground, and in the pipe, just slightly less than the diameter of the pipe, is a ping pong ball, and you have a coat hanger. How to best get the ping pong ball out of the pipe without destroying it? And so we conjure up various things and draw various ways we would bend the coat hanger. And one of the students suddenly leapt up and said, "Pee in the pipe. Everybody pee in the pipe. We have enough pee to fill the pipe." And he had gone outside the frame, and we have us. We're tools too. We have pee in us. We can do this thing. So that type of mentorship, and can you imagine that type of mindful consciousness arising mentorship when we're like 16, 17 years old. And then before we hit university or our first job, we have a deep exploration of our conscious capacity and work on a lot of the healing we need. And it's all guided. It will totally transform the universities, because the student body that are coming in, they're not just there to party. I mean, they're going to party, but they're self-knowing at that point. They're self-authoring humans. It's a total game changer if we can do this in the generation, in that sort of age range, and mentorship from elders, not just mentorship from medicines, because you just have to have people in the room that can tell the story and offer the wisdom and offer the pitfalls and the cautionary tales as well.
I just finally listened to this Huxley lecture the other day that allegedly was the inspiration for the human potential movement. And it seems relevant here because he commented, probably in the early 50s or 56-ish maybe, about science being hampered by this problem of overspecialization. Is there any kind of discussion you like to have around that and how this process could bust that up a little bit?
It's in some sense I've lived the process, and perhaps because I bounced around like a ping pong ball, or maybe more like a billiard ball in some ways with an 8 on it. So I had my North Star. My dream was to work on the origin of life. I had my first sort of endo-trip download when I was 14, where I saw this bundle of molecules moving around just ahead of me, because I'd asked the question seriously. I was really seriously asking the question. And my training at the time was, chemistry is sticks and balls, and there's something called thermodynamics. And I didn't know much more, but I knew just enough for an endo-trip vision to pop in from who knows where. And the bundle of molecules seemed to be moving with some sort of driven process. And I asked it, well, what's running you, and what are the underlying processes? And it said, I'm a machine, figure out how I made a copy of myself. And I said, that doesn't work, because machines need bigger machines to make them. Cars are made in factories. That's a nonsensical question. And it winked at me, another winking apparition, work on it. And so throughout my life, I held that. So when I went into computer science or virtual worlds work or NASA spacecraft design, I was always looking for that clue about how do things start and get complex on their own. And that led to the vision with ayahuasca, and then the endo-trip, and all my work on PhD work, and late night discussions with Terence on novelty. He was very fascinated with novelty. And what is novelty? What's the driver for novelty? And so it was a thread, a golden thread, if you will, through life. And if you held on to that, rather than saying, what specialization do I need to be in, and working on intuition, you bounce around through multiple fields, picking up experience in different things, but holding to that. And then you find yourself with patients. By my early 50s, I found myself in the laboratory of Dave Deemer at his house. And Dave was my mentor. Dave was going to be the person to take all of these ideations and land it into actual chemistry that would work in this universe. And then we became this partnership. So what I would suggest, if you're fortunate enough to hold this long enough, that the field or whatever magic matrix that we're all in will eventually bounce you to the right place. That intelligence will get you to that magical place where you realize, okay, all the elements are there, and you have to be patient for that. And then the training in chemistry, the training in thermodynamics and complexity that I had to undergo for 10 years, and then the breakthrough, and then along the way, the concoctions of tryptamine psychedelics, which allowed me to unravel things and then unlock capacities that were probably innate, and they're innate in all of us. So it's a lot of stuff there. So I got a multidisciplinary education just by moving around a lot, but holding the golden thread and saying, if I want to make a breakthrough, like somebody wants to make a breakthrough in energy production, just hold on to that and go where it leads you. And maybe there's a bigger intelligence around this complex world that will lead you to the right places to meet the right people, the right times. And we see this in business all the time. Meeting Ford and Sylvia just before leaving the party, I had kind of thought I was done. I was done the science. There wasn't another big project. And suddenly there's this other amazing project called Minds, and that actually pulls together after my science, after the science has been baked and is rolling. I felt like that's enough to achieve for a lifetime. Then this whole new thing, which actually has a huge societal impact potential, and it's a joy. It's like I get up in the morning and like, I'm going to talk to Joe Moore of Psychedelics today, and I wrote to the team, and it's so exciting to have this new thing that it's like the icing on the cake after this long journey, if you will, long strange trip.
That's beautiful. And I think you're right. Patience and perseverance, keeping that curiosity alive is important too. And I think a lot of people can just kind of like fade into what the patterns are, just work the academic system for retirement, not necessarily for advancement of the field in a really meaningful way. And there's so much left to do here. And I think Minds is hopefully going to be, is the plan to share a lot of these frameworks that get developed to help kind of democratize the practices, or?
Yes. Also from MAP's playbook, the idea is we sponsor a ton of research. So we get a decade of research. Also connect with practice groups and individuals in their communities. Share your protocol. And if you go to centerforminds.org, we have a brief survey, which is going to be developed next year into a full university-based survey. But what is your protocol? What has downloaded for you? How have you landed that? Your setting and setup. And collect all that data, because it's all out there. Before MAPS, got its first FDA-approved study, or Hefter and all the organizations, there were a lot of historical, retrospective, observational studies of people, say, using MDMA for social anxiety, for example. And that was case building for the government to say this has societal benefit. Clearly, we need to approve studies, because that's what the Schedule 1 thing is. There's no benefit to society. It's harmful to society. So we do the same thing. So if you share your stories, if you're working in a group, if you've developed setting and set up your protocols, that'll help us to design studies where we can actually do the protocol development from the basis of, say, psilocybin's effect on memory, on episodic memory. That's a low-level cognitive study that we would like to support. Or microdosing. There is a ton of microdosing happening, and very little dollars are available to sponsor research into microdosing. And Jim Fadiman's talked about this. He's calling for more science. And then how do you study all the complexities of creativity itself? And so 5 or 10 years from now, we can publish protocols that we think are effective for this kind of a practice. Then what happens is blooming a set of retreat centers, which are already there for sort of creativity and better business, but then they will have some grounded data evidence-based practice around it, and also for safety, for efficaciousness. And then we're working on a frame that is a little more grounded than everyone's idea of what works and what doesn't. That's what science is about. That's what testing is about.
Right.
And those will be open protocols. And then one more thing to add here, Joe, is what happens if we do get a generation of people who really have dialed in their self-authoring, and they're becoming creative founts, kind of like Buckminster Fuller when he was just cranking out idea after idea, but they have no place to land it in business. Well, because a lot of Mind's donor base will be from entrepreneurs who had creative insights and then created successful business, they potentially can come in and help us create a venture organization, kind of like Y Combinator, but for genius downloads. That a whole, in a sense, process flow of Jedis of all ages, but there'll probably be a lot of young people there who've had these incredible insights, can get their insights due diligenced, mentored, and then put into actual investor-funded enterprises. And then those enterprises can also support Minds and other organizations to fund more research, to figure out how to unlock more genius and how to create more healed and revealed humans. So then the business side is tied back to the creation of the fount of its origination in a way. So that's what we're calling Minds.Ventures. And that I think will happen as this flow begins of people flowing through the practices.
That's wild. Yeah, I love it. I wonder, it's a fun thing. Like, we need the science to be really firm. We're also confronted with this incredible, uncomfortable urgency globally. And how do we do that with grace at the same time? Both of them, some sort of grace. I don't know if it's going to really look like grace, but it's going to be an interesting ride. I'm really thankful you all are doing it. I would like to understand more and perhaps support in some way if I can. It's very heartening. So thank you.
You're so welcome, Joe, and thank you for the opportunity to talk on your platform. And it's new, it's fresh and new. It's like my baby red fresh face here, which I'm not sure why is it so red. Am I that red? Anyway, I guess I am. So thank you for allowing us to bring this really new thing, which is actually quite an old idea, back to the community. And we hope that we'll have sufficient support to really get the job done. And we know you're out there, these other minds, and we just really welcome any of the shares that are the beautiful practices and experiences that are out there, and that's the basis. That for every story we get, it encourages us to go forward.
That's fantastic. So, folks, please share. This is really important for the future of humans living on Earth. So, and hopefully beyond. And Bruce, anything else you'd like to mention? Any websites or projects beyond this one?
Well, there's so much. I think it's sign up for our updates, certainly on Center for Minds. If you're interested in the origin of life, you can find a lot of our team and our labs work at biota.org, Biota Institute, biota.org. And I have a long history in spacecraft design and concepts, and it's just all everywhere out there. And I hope it it encourages y'all or whoever is out there and feeling a little hopeless about manifesting their creative gifts, that it can be done. And you can kind of just be your own initiative, being your own enterprise, and decide that you're just gonna do it. Saying no to some things is important to open doors for new things. But my life story certainly isn't perfect, and I made a lot of missteps. But and I have to say, the number one thing is find older people, find mentors. If I hadn't found Terrence, if I hadn't found Dave Deemer and others, you can think you've got it all, the whole answer and what to do next. You probably don't. Even at age 50, I needed mentors for the next phase. I needed them at all ages.
I love that. That's beautiful. Could you mention briefly the work you did with Matt Siegel recently? He's a contributor to the show and a friend of ours.
Yes. So Matt's pretty remarkable. He's a Whiteheadian process philosopher scholar at CIIS here in the Bay Area. And for those of you in the know, Whitehead was one of Terrence's favorite philosophers from the 1920s. And I got fascinated with Whiteheadian thought. And I happened to meet Matt at an event here in Boulder Creek in 2018 or something. And we were just gobsmacked with each other. Here's a young person building a career to bring some of the most powerful ideas in philosophy into the modern age. And I was trying to bring some of the most powerful new discoveries in science into the modern age with the hopes for societal change. And we worked out in a flash how Whitehead's idea of sort of a continuum of occasions that come into being and connect was actually very much represented in the wet-dry cycling of protocells. And it's like, wait a minute, this is a process philosophy approach to the coming into being of the living world, and an explanation for reality itself and how life is working. And so we went to conferences together, and on one trip up to Oregon to a process philosophy conference in Oregon, it all just came together in that drive. And we ended up creating a chapter for a major book that's just come out. And it's literally the cosmological context of the origin of life. That the origin of life itself isn't an isolated, single, rare event. It's actually based upon flows that are coming in from the solar system, processes and cycles, memories created, all this sort of stuff. And so we bolted it all together where philosophy meets hard science, which is not a common instance, actually. Philosophy and the experimental sciences have split for many hundreds of years. We found a way to hinge them together again. And I think it's very, very exciting work. And what Matt describes is that in periods of disruption, philosophy comes and plays a role. So in the 1920s, it was Bertrand Russell and Whitehead and all these people came into the time of quantum mechanics. So suddenly there's all this chaos in physics, like this uncertain Heisenberg and uncertainty, and Einstein, declaring that God doesn't play dice with the universe. And there was all this kind of, what? This is how reality works at the low level. These proposals that are mathematical, but these conundrums like the double slit experiment and things like this. And philosophy sort of blossomed in that period. And in the origin of life, this is disruptive. This is a Kuhnian paradigm shift going on right now, right today, between a kind of rigid serialist approach, especially around the hydrothermal vent in the ocean, which doesn't work thermodynamically. It's like against the second law, and you don't want to be that, to this whole new model, which is a brand new conception, a very complex, but an actually empirically demonstrable conception on how life began, and it's disruptive. So there's a fight going on in our field between the ocean vent community and the origin of life on land, hydrothermal springs community, and as this shift occurred in 2020 that was in the pages of Nature. Cuss words being used in New York Times articles and things like this. All the classic things you'd expect in a Kuhnian paradigm shift. And so in comes philosophy. So there's this opening for like, we're confused. You mean life didn't start as individuals in competition? It started in some sort of network boot? What? And the reductionist materialist approach is here, but then there's this overall thing, and it's still a materialist explanation, but it's so freakingly more complex and subtle and nuanced. And so we're in this wonderful period, and this is where Matt has come in, and it's just been, it's one of the many spokes of implications coming out from what might be a rather Copernican discovery or proposal that will impact field after field after field, but it's now coming into philosophy through Matt Siegel.
Beautiful. Wow. what a thing. And thanks for sharing that. He's always so kind and interesting. He's got such great insights almost everywhere I point him.
Almost everywhere you point him, yeah.
All right, Bruce Damer, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and I hope we can do more as things develop.
Absolutely, Joe. And as your last name says, more further.
Thank you.
We have a bus on the property called No Further, but I think in your honor, I'm going to name it More Further.
We can go more further together.
We can.
All right. Until next time, Bruce. Thank you.
Pleasure.